Hello, in this video, I'm actually going to do the last two parts of the Deleuze and Guattari and worker strike resolution videos, or I guess I'll do one more video after this, but these will be the last two videos for the series. I forgot in the last video when I was doing the outro that I definitely want to talk about how to answer Deleuze and Guattari arguments when on the affirmative as kind of the last portion of this series, and so I definitely want to get into talking about that a little bit in order to end the series out, because I think the last two videos we had a really good conversation talking about what these affirmatives really look like on the resolution, and so I think it's really important to consider what type of arguments that are available to read against it, what some of the best go-to arguments are, where your focus should be, so that you can have a lot better time prepping against these arguments, or if you're reading these arguments, you can kind of like know what you should be looking out for and what the most like potent arguments are. And so I definitely think considering like both sides and looking through the videos and then looking at maybe the intro to Deleuze and Guattari and the worker strike stuff will still be relevant here, because it just lays out a lot of the fundamental basis for it. I think are kind of like all the angles that Deleuze and Guattari kind of like have in this resolution, and we talked a lot about like how the different portions of their critique kind of like pertain to the different portions of the resolution, and being tapped into all that stuff is really helpful to kind of give context to the conversation that we'll be continuing and having in this video, where we kind of talk a little bit about just like what are some of the priorities versus this argument, and then how you should be kind of like thinking about like what the best case arguments are and the best like framework and T arguments in order to kind of like complement maybe some of your beginning strategy against like what this argument could be. And yeah, hopefully this video will be super helpful. So the first place that I definitely want to start off is just thinking about what are the priorities versus affirmatives like this. I definitely think that when you're debating affirmatives like this, the first thing that I think is really on my mind is what are the ways that you can kind of like win, kind of like I said before, that things like assemblage theory, nomadism, and war machine kind of, and the way that they're thinking about the relationship that the war machine has to the state and various other portions of civil society. I think that it's like really important to consider these things, because I think that a lot of the questions that will end up being pertinent on a lot of other flows and a lot of the other arguments you could be read is definitely kind of breaking up this kind of like idea that things like affect and other forms of like connectivism and like positive orientation towards desire kind of means that we can kind of like establish all of these kind of like lucid connections between us, institutions, like an easy flow through the identity grid, etc. And I think that that can be done through a variety of ways. I think that on the kind of like policy spectrum of things, there are a lot of arguments being made about why there isn't such easy access to institutions, why there has to be specific and precise demands, why there has to be a kind of like organizational vertical effort in order to like make those demands palatable and make sense. On the kind of like more critical end, there are a lot of arguments to be made about why that kind of form of like positive connectivism basically assumes these kind of like easily moving relations that don't really take into context how forms of like racial dispossession and histories of disparagement have kind of changed the terms and conditions for how people can like interact with things like the identity grid, how they can slide in and out of various types of institutions, what that access looks like, and what types of options are available in terms of like what resistances like makes sense and is palpable. And I think that regardless of which direction that you want to go, really developing that set of arguments along your stuff is super important to being successful, because it gets at the crux of like what a lot of the kind of like more I guess like what a lot of what the more like method justification basis is going to be, and also gets at a lot of kind of the central problem that the affirmative is probably going to be dictating about the way in which the status quo works. And so I think at both levels, in terms of like the material kind of like resolution level and at the level of like what the kind of like theoretical kind of like critique of the topic is, you definitely have like offense and good places on both sides. I think that then when you kind of like move this into like what types of case arguments you should be really specifically making, I think once again, like if you're a policy team, this is a place where you should early on start the debate about just having a concentrated argument about like why the way in which they're theorizing the kind of connection between institutions and those outside of them, people, etc., is not the same as like what they're kind of considering in terms of like assemblage theory, and then also being able to win that when you're kind of considering some of these other stuff, these other arguments on case, that the idea that we're not able to, that we're able to access that kind of like institutional change or scaling via our ability to like work outside of like legal language, legal demands, etc., are all really important like places to make on case. I think in other teams that are trying to go other places outside of just like the policy engagement question, I think that a lot of the offense that you really want to then make is just like method hits. I think that really being able to like spam a lot of arguments about like why the particular method that the affirmative is uptaking and how they think about how these movements are created is like not either a proper reading history or a good understanding of like the ways in which like movements are made at a realistic level, and therefore their response can only really happen at the level of just like theoretical relationships to things like affect and desire, which don't necessarily transcend into like material changes in people's lives, and being able to disconnect them from being able to go from the type of offense that they want to go for when they kind of like pivot themselves into being able to like make more debates about just the materiality question. And so then you're kind of like forcing them to either win this kind of like top level theory debate or just lose the whole debate because you're forcing them to win, that there's a connection in the justification between the two things, and that if that internal link is missing, then they're not really able to access the offense or the framing of the debate that they really want to. I think when you transition all of this advice into like what you should be thinking about, like in terms of a framework to debate, I think a lot of the arguments that you really want to make are about why the kind of justification for this affirmative to be read on the resolution would probably justify a lot of other interpretations or a lot of other affirmatives. I think that you really want to force this team into having an impact turn debate, and I think that although there's definitely a lot of ways in which they have offense and like ways to like kind of like put themselves in a good position in impact turn debate, I definitely think there are also options for you. I feel like even if you're maybe not winning, that like all of the kind of like moral consequences of being able to have everyone debate the resolution the same way is like particularly that good. I feel like a lot of the arguments that you're able to win if you're able to create really specific impact framing mechanisms about why the kind of more procedural terms are like necessary for stable engagement in order to get some of the more like moral epistemological value out of debate, then you're really ahead on being able to like get a lot of that offense out there. And I think it makes it a lot easier for you to be able to like push the pace on why those kind of like procedural terms are like valuable in terms of being able to like make it possible to even consider the more like epistemological value of the affirmative, and that if the resolution kind of like allowed or made space for like people to be able to just echo resistance from like any kind of chamber that refuses to state, like the amount of affirmatives that could be created and the basis of that would be not only like extremely unpredictable, but also dilute the ability for there to be like really in-depth debates about like the consequences of such movements and whether or not there is kind of like a stasis for there to be like a negative engagement in such a way that produces like a positive change in like the ways in which those affirmatives are able to be tested and refine themselves. And I think that making arguments about argument refinement can definitely be super good, along with any creative topical versions of the AF you have about being able to access any type of momentum from like the resolution proper that adds like additional value to movements that happen outside of the state, or allows for the momentum of the creation of movements that can be recognized otherwise outside of just the confines of the worker strike. And I think that the more creative you can get with those, the more that you're rewarded in being able to both beat that they don't really access the consequences of weighing their affirmative without the kind of like specificity of legible political demands, along with the procedural value of having a stable topic in order to like test and retest those demands in order to get closer to what the affirmative is doing than the AF is, which is I think a really strategic negative position to be in. Hopefully this video is helpful for you, and hopefully you'll be able to tune into the rest of the videos that I'll be doing just in general. And yeah, thanks for tuning in as always.